Every academic account of ancient Iran agrees on this much. The Achaemenid kings knelt to a single god and called him wise. What none of them agree on is whether that makes Darius the Great and his heirs the first Zoroastrians in recorded history, or something stranger, the last stage of an older Persian faith still finding its final shape. That argument, unresolved after more than a century of scholarship, is the whole story tonight. Because in the 25 centuries since, this religion has survived a burning capital, an empire that made its own name illegal to speak, and an exodus by sea that its own descendants still cannot fully agree on. Somewhere in that record is a faith older than almost anything else still practiced on earth. Somewhere in it is also a live argument about how old older really is. Start where the arguing gets loudest, in a palace on fire in the spring of 330 BCE. The palace was Persepolis, stone columns 40 feet high, painted once in reds and blues, long since bleached pale by desert sun. Gold drinking vessels stacked in a treasury built for an empire that assumed it would last forever. Carved reliefs of tribute bearers walking in endless procession up a staircase built for a king who believed his throne came from a single, all-seeing god named Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. 2 centuries earlier, Darius the Great had carved his own account of that god into a cliff face at Bisotun, crediting him directly for the crown on his head. His son Xerxes went further, recording how he tore down a rival shrine and replaced its worship with the wise lords alone. None of this was hidden, none of it needed to be. For 200 years, the god of the Persian kings required no protection, because the empire that worshipped him stretched from Egypt to the edge of India, and no one alive could seriously threaten it. The wise lord had no temple walls built for him in this era. The historian Herodotus, writing while the empire still stood, recorded that the Persians of his time worshipped in the open air, needing no walls between themselves and their god. Notice what's missing from the official story most people learn about this period: any sense that it could end. It never once occurred to a Persian king that his god's name might someday need to be whispered instead of carved in stone. That certainty is worth sitting with, because everything that follows is the story of what happens when it turns out to be wrong. By 330 BCE, a Macedonian in his 20s had already burned through the empire's western half. Alexander's armies broke the Persian line at Gaugamela, chased King Darius III into the eastern provinces, and walked into Persepolis unopposed. What happened next is not in dispute among historians. The palace complex burned. Whether by accident during a night of drinking or by deliberate order, the fire took the columns, the archives, and, according to Zoroastrian tradition recorded centuries afterward, the priests who served as the religion's living memory. This is where the story splits into 2 versions, and it's worth being honest about which is which. The version Zoroastrian religious texts tell, written some 800 years after the fact under the Sassanian kings who followed, is vivid and specific. One account, the letter of Tansar, puts it in 9 words. Iskandar burned our religious books written on 12,000 ox hides. Alexander earned a title in these texts that some Persians still use today. Not Alexander the Great, but Gizistag, the Accursed. The version historians can independently confirm is narrower and in some ways grimmer. The Avesta, this faith's scripture, was not yet written down in 330 BCE. It existed the way it always had, memorized, chanted, carried whole inside the minds of a trained priesthood, the Magi. There was no library of ox hides for Alexander to burn, because the library was made of people. What we do know for certain is that Persepolis burned, and that the Magi died in numbers no surviving record counts. This wasn't the first time in the ancient world that a conqueror erased a rival's memory simply by killing the people who carried it, nor would it be the last. What both versions agree on, 5 centuries apart in their telling, is that something irreplaceable was lost that spring. It would take Persia 4 more centuries to answer that loss. Under the Sassanian kings, starting with Ardashir I in 224,
Zoroastrianism became the empire's official religion for the first time, and the faith's guardians finally began writing the Avesta down, inventing a new alphabet for the purpose because no existing script could hold the sound of the old prayers. The project took roughly 100 years and 3 kings to finish. Pull back and you'll notice the shape of that timeline. It took losing everything once, catastrophically, before anyone thought to write any of it down at all. Then, in 642, at a battle called Nahavand, it happened again. An army under the general Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas broke the last organized Sassanian resistance in a single engagement Arab chroniclers still call the Victory of Victories. Within a decade, the last Sassanian king was dead, hunted across his own collapsing empire, and Zoroastrianism lost its second protector in less than 1,000 years. Look at the pattern before we go any further, because it matters for everything that follows. Twice now, nearly 1,000 years apart, it wasn't the faith itself that collapsed first. It was the throne standing in front of it. The same playbook worked both times. Remove the king who protects a religion, and that religion stops being a settled fact of the empire and becomes instead something its own people have to negotiate to keep. The new administration classified Zoroastrians as protected subjects, dhimmi, who could keep their faith on one condition: a tax, the jizya, paid for the privilege of not converting. Here's what I find striking about that arrangement, and it's easy to miss if you rush past it. This wasn't a fine for a crime. It was a price set by the state for continuing to be who you already were, payable indefinitely by anyone willing to keep paying it. Look at who benefited from that system, and the answer isn't only converts who gained exemption. The administration itself gained a permanent, self-renewing source of revenue from every household that chose faith over money. A minority that converted stopped paying. A minority that resisted kept the treasury funded. There was no version of that arrangement that didn't end eventually in fewer Zoroastrians. Conversion followed, but not the way conquest stories usually get told, not as a single command obeyed overnight. It happened over generations, household by household, driven by sincere faith in some homes and by the plain exhaustion of paying to remain a minority in others. Persian language and administration survived the transition largely intact and fed directly into the intellectual life of the empire that replaced the one it had served. The religion at the center of that empire did not survive nearly as well. Now, a reassurance, because this is the point in a religious history where people brace for an attack on the faith itself. This isn't that. Every date given tonight,
The reign of Darius, the burning of Persepolis, even the birth of Zoroaster himself, carries an asterisk somewhere in the scholarship. Some traditions place the prophet 3 centuries before Alexander. The language of his own surviving hymns, the oldest layer of the Avesta, suggests something far older still, perhaps 1500 years earlier than that. Historians have never fully closed that gap, and probably never will. What this tells us about the difference between history and faith is simple enough. Several 100,000 people on 3 continents will light a fire in Zoroaster's name again tonight, regardless of which date turns out to be right. The dates argue among scholars. The practice, out in the world, never once stopped to wait for them to agree. By the middle of the 7th century, that practice reached its narrowest point yet. Stay and pay for the right to remain what you were born. Convert, and the tax disappeared along with the difference. Or leave, toward a coastline none of them had seen, carrying nothing that couldn't fit in a boat, and a small collection of sacred ash and implements meant for lighting a fire again on the other side. As far as anyone alive that year could have guessed, this faith was headed toward extinction, not toward permanence. You might think this is ancient history, but somewhere on the western coast of India tonight, a fire first kindled from those same sacred ashes has been burning without interruption for well over 1,300 years, tended by hands that have never once let it go dark. 2 empires tried to end this faith by ending the throne that sheltered it. Neither one thought to ask what happens when the believers simply carry the coals out the door. It didn't go out. Salt air, and under it something stranger, the smell of cold ash carried inside a sealed clay jar across a strait no map from that century fully agrees on. Inside the jar, ash from a sacred fire, a ring, a handful of coarse hair from the tail of a bull. Nothing about the jar suggested it was worth guarding with your life. Everything about the people guarding it said otherwise. This is what actually crossed the water when Zoroastrian families fled Persia for India, sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries. Not a single flame that had somehow never gone out, whatever the later legends insisted. Raw material, the ingredients for starting over, and nothing more than that. They landed on the Gujarat coast, near a small settlement called Sanjan, ruled by a local prince named Jadi Rana. The community's own 400-year-old founding epic, the Kissa-i Sanjan, tells what happened next. The prince, wary of armed strangers arriving on his shore, sent out a bowl of milk filled to the brim. His kingdom, he meant, was full, with no room left for newcomers. The refugee's priest is said to have stirred in a spoonful of sugar without spilling a single drop. It dissolved completely. The milk did not overflow. It only sweetened. Moved, or so the story goes, Jadi Rana granted them land on 3 conditions: that they adopt the local language, dress their women in local fashion, and lay down their weapons. Whether that exact conversation ever took place, no contemporary record can confirm. The epic recounting it was written down some 700 or 800 years after the events it describes, by a priest working from memory and community tradition, not from any surviving eyewitness account. What can be independently confirmed is what came after the story ends. Using the ash and the ring and the bull's hair they had carried across the sea, priests at Zanzibar consecrated a new fire in the year 721. They gave it the highest rank a Zoroastrian fire can hold, an honor reserved, even today, for only a handful of fires in the entire world. That fire has not stopped burning since. It has, however, moved constantly, and every single move was a retreat from danger, not a choice. When Zanzibar itself came under attack generations later, priests carried the flame up into a cave high on Barot Hill and kept it alive there for roughly 12 years. No temple, no columns, no gold, just a fire, tended in the dark by people waiting for an army to lose interest and move on. It worked. The army moved on. From Barot, the fire went down to Bansda. From Bansda to the town of Navsari, where it stayed more than 2 centuries, with one brief evacuation to Surat during a period of lawlessness. From Navsari to Bulsar, and finally, in 1742, to a quiet coastal village called Udvada, where it burns today in a plain, unremarkable building that most tourists passing through Gujarat have never even heard of. 1,300 years old, this fire has been chased by 3 different regimes across 4 different centuries, hidden in at least one cave, and has outlasted every single one of the powers that tried to end it. Now hold that story next to a very different one, unfolding 1,000 miles away and 11 centuries later. In 1854, a Bombay merchant named Manekji Limji Hataria boarded a ship to Iran, taking his 16-year-old son Hormozji with him. He had been sent by wealthy Parsis in India, the descendants by then of those original refugees, to find out what had happened to the Zoroastrians who never left. According to the Encyclopedia Iranicus account of his mission, Hataria spent his first year simply traveling and observing before writing anything down at all. What he eventually documented took a year to fully compile. Malnutrition, disease, centuries of attacks that had ground a once powerful faith down to a population Hataria himself counted city by city at just 7,200 people in the entire country that had invented the religion. What strikes me most about that number is what it meant in practice. An empire whose kings once carved their god's name into cliff faces was, by 1854, down to fewer believers than a single mid-sized town. Hataria did not leave, and he did not soften what he found into something easier to report. For 35 years, until his death in Tehran in 1890, he built schools in Yazd and Kerman, funded repairs to fire temples that Iranian law had forbidden Zoroastrians from, maintaining and negotiated patiently and at real personal risk, since the same historical record notes repeated threats and attempts on his life, with a Qajar king who had no obvious reason to listen to a foreign merchant. He kept negotiating anyway. Follow the money. And part of the answer to why he eventually succeeded becomes clear.
British diplomats, leaned on by Parsi industrialists in Bombay, who now controlled real economic weight across the empire, applied outside pressure that a lone missionary could never have managed on his own. In 1882, the tax that had been draining Iran's Zoroastrian community for over 1,000 years was finally abolished. This wasn't the first time in this story that a people's survival depended on someone from far away refusing to look away. We've seen this before, on the Gujarat coast 11 centuries earlier. A stranger's kingdom took them in once. A stranger's persistence rebuilt what was left of them twice. The question nobody asks about a story like this is what happens after the rescue. The honest answer is, slow decline continues anyway, just at a gentler pace. A Pulitzer Center investigation into the community's modern demographic crisis found that India's Parsi population fell from around 69,000 in 2001 to just over 57,000 a decade later, an 18% drop in 10 years in a single census cycle. Iran's Zoroastrian community today numbers somewhere between 15 and 25,000. Sound familiar? It should. Low birth rates, aging populations, and a faith that has never sought converts are quietly finishing what conquest started, just without an army attached to it. This is not just a story about the past. In 1946, a boy named Farooq Bulsara was born in Zanzibar to a Parsi family with roots in Bulsar, the very same waypoint town this fire passed through on its way to Udvada. He would later call himself Freddie Mercury. He rarely spoke publicly about the faith he was raised in, but by his mother's own account, he stayed proud of it. When he died in 1991, 2 Zoroastrian priests presided over his funeral. He was cremated, a modern adaptation of the funerary rite his ancestors would not have recognized, since there was no Tower of Silence anywhere near London, only a family determined to send him off in the faith he was born into anyway. 3 things stand out to me, looking back across both of these stories at once. A prince who chose sugar over suspicion on a beach he had every reason to defend instead. A merchant who refused to stop counting his people at 7,200 and call the matter finished 3 decades into a mission nobody was paying him enough to justify. A family that kept lighting a lamp in an English suburb because it was still theirs to light, 4 generations and 2 continents removed from Sanjan, in a country that had never heard of Ahura Mazda, and mostly still hasn't. History doesn't teach us that empires decide whether a religion survives. It teaches us something narrower, and honestly more useful, that the deciding vote nearly always belongs to a small number of specific named people, making a specific, unglamorous choice, usually with no idea that anyone would still be telling the story 25 centuries later. A prince, a merchant, a family with a lamp. 3 small decisions, none of them made by anyone who knew it would matter this much. The empires all fell, every single one of them. The lamp is still burning in Udvada tonight, and somebody is still tending it. The candle burns low. The questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious. Of everything in this story, one thing is worth carrying with you. Was it the fire that survived 25 centuries of conquest, the language that outlived every empire that tried to replace it, or simply the refusal of ordinary people to let a stranger's tax decide
who they were.